Hey there, everybody, and welcome. In this lesson, we're going to dive a bit deeper on how to render your animations in Adobe After Effects. Now, there's a few different ways that you can render, and so I'm going to show you both the Adobe Media Encoder method as well as the render queue method. So we'll start with probably the most used method in this day and age is going to render through the Media Encoder. So Media Encoder is a second app that comes packaged with programs such as Adobe Premiere Pro and Adobe After Effects and whatnot, and it allows you to kind of compress and output different file types. So in this particular animation, I'm going to make sure that I select the composition that I want to render. At that point, I'm going to go to Composition because I want to render that composition, and I'm going to go Add to Adobe Media Encoder. What that will do is load Adobe Media Encoder. Now, this is a really powerful software that allows you to kind of go through and select different presets. So for instance, if I'm going down here and I want Apple ProRes as a compression type, or if I want to, keep mine in MP4 or H.264, I can really go through these settings depending on the project that I have and match them, whatever the client's needs may be. For the most part, H.264 is going to work for most people, especially if you're outputting to things like YouTube and not really broadcast television. Now, if we look at Media Encoder as a whole, when we added it to our Media Encoder, it went ahead and loaded that composition, and it gave us a few different options. The first option is a drop-down to tell us what type of file we want to output. In other words, H.264 would be an MP4 file. We could output an AVI file, or we may even go down to QuickTime if you want to output an MOV file. This is also a great piece of software to kind of convert different file types on the fly if you need to take an H.264 and convert it to an MOV or vice versa. The next step is the source. So this will help us adjust the quality. Right now I can match it to whatever I have in Adobe After Effects, but I can downres that in case I'm giving it to a client as a work in progress and I don't want them to think it's the final version. I can also go and output this for devices like Twitter, mobile devices, you name it, we can kind of play with that. The output file is simply that. We can go ahead and render this to a specific folder so we know where to find it, which is really good. And then this is telling us our status is ready. Now, at this point, we have the ability to kind of change this around a little bit and play with the encoding. So if I click on, instead of doing the drop down on that setting, you'll notice it opens a whole new window that gives me even more fine-tune ability to play with things like the frame rate, the field order, aspect ratio, you name it. And this will allow me to dial it in, add comments to the video, whatever it may be, embed metadata to really customize the video and its final quality. Because if size is an issue with your videos, this is the area you want to go to by clicking on the match source to open up that export settings panel. So again, if you know what you're doing with compression, that's where you want to go. To render this out, we simply hit play and then click on our output folder, and voila, we have a lovely little animation ready to go. So that's the kind of, I would call it the newer way. I've been doing After Effects for a few years, but the older way is something called Render Queue, and you'll see Render Queue is available as one of your tabs in your timeline. So to add a composition to Render Queue, it's very similar. You're going to select the composition you want to render. You're going to do Add to Render Queue this time, and that's under the Compositions window. When you do that, you get this big kind of project, and this is great. Again, both these softwares can do batch. You can add multiple compositions. You can render multiple scenes sequentially if need be. The thing to remember with Render Queue is you're going to want to make sure that you click on some of these blue settings. So anytime you see blue, it says output to. So I'm going to go, okay, I want to output this to my render folder, and that's going to go ahead and tell me that's where it's going to go. The second thing is, what's the quality? So here, it's very similar to those render settings, again, but a little less visual options. I can kind of go through and adjust. So I can set this to H.264 to make it an MP4 file. I could just render the alpha channel if I'm doing any QuickTime or, if I want to just render kind of a track mat or anything like that. I can also adjust the different audio or resize the video as I output it. And the final thing is that render settings, and this is kind of, again, just a dialed down version. If you're doing works in progress, you could set it to 1/3 to render a smaller version just to get an idea of what you're doing. You hit OK and you're good to go. Now, once you have those settings set, it's as easy as either hitting render, which will render it out, or you can even add this to the Adobe Media Encoder queue if need be. So if you're still like, oh shoot, I want to put that on Media Encoder, you can do that. So I'm going to go ahead and hit render, and it's going to say, hey, it's going to override a file. That's fine. And it's going to go through and render my file relatively quickly. It says 2 seconds. That's awesome. So in the end, this is really a couple different ways to output your different file types using Adobe After Effects and Adobe Media Encoder. Hope you enjoyed the lesson, and I'll see you next time.